Donald Trump's calling our Somali neighbors garbage and the state of Minnesota a hellhole is I'm assuming is untrue.
What if someone enforces Sharia law? There's a lot of talk of that.
Enough is enough. Enough is enough.
There's a lot of talk about people in Minnesota are terrified that someone's going to enforce Sharia law in a lot of these Somali Muslim areas where giant Muslim populations are.
We are doctors, we are teachers, entrepreneurs. We are elected representatives of our...
So apparently Tim Walz's legacy survived the elections, but it didn't survive a Joe Rogan rant. One conversation, zero mercy, and suddenly everyone is asking questions no one ever wanted answered. What set Rogan off? Why did it spiral this fast? And how did a casual exchange turn into a full-scale legacy audit? Stay with this, because the clip is awkward, unintentionally hilarious, and clear proof that a live microphone can be far more dangerous than any debate stage.
There's video of Tim Walz doing the exact same thing.
Right.
Exact same thing, and
Yes.
he said, of course it's a Nazi salute. He said that.
Right, right.
We spent 3 days debating, having them trying to debate that President Musk gave a Nazi salute. Of course he did. But that is a distraction.
This is how crazy things have gotten. Like,
It's coordinated.
you haven't seen that?
No.
The video of him taking down the Minnesota flag. And
The moment Joe Rogan started circling the idea of Tim Walz's legacy, something subtle but almost perfect happened. No fireworks, no shouting, just that quiet, creeping feeling of, oh, this is really happening. The kind of moment where a politician's mental filing cabinet starts to jam simply because someone isn't following the usual script.
Tim Walz is out there talking again.
Did you say you could fight any Trump supporter?
Yeah.
I think I could kick most of their ass. I do think that if they want to do that. I know I can outrun them, but I don't know if we're going to fall into that place where we want to.
He says he kicked their ass, and they're scared of him because he could fix a truck. Because they're threatened by his masculinity. I know how to fix a truck. So he said, like, do you?
I think I scare them a little bit why they spend so much time on it. But no, I'm serious because I can fix a truck. They know I'm not bullshitting on this. I'm not putting this in people's grill.
I bet you don't.
The lady doth protest too
I
much.
bet you don't.
And if you're enjoying this takedown so far, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you think. This wasn't a shouting match or a viral gotcha clip engineered in some dark editing room. This was worse. This was curiosity with cardio. Joe Rogan didn't accuse, he wondered. And as he wondered, Tim Walz's carefully polished legacy started to feel less like a monument and more like an IKEA bookshelf assembled at 2 a.m.
Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who was running for vice president.
I'd never seen this before. People driving by my house and using the R word in front of people. This is shameful.
They just passed something in Minnesota where illegal immigrants are allowed to have driver's licenses and vote, which is kind of crazy.
And I have yet to see an elected official, a Republican elected official, say, you're right, that's shameful.
A lot of the reason for wanting an open border is congressional seats.
So look, I'm worried. We know how these things go. They start with taunts, they turn to violence.
Because one of the things about when you do a census, it doesn't...
At first, everything sounded fine, respectful. Even Tim Walz's record just hovered there, like a resume being read out loud at a networking event. Accomplishments were politely acknowledged. Decisions stood tall. But Joe Rogan has a knack for doing something quietly unsettling. He asks what happens after the headline.
I think they're lost. I mean, they're also lost in that they can't control the narrative anymore. I think when they had control of Twitter and they had control of essentially all of social media and pre-Trump, they had the reins like firmly held. They were in control of the public narrative. If you strayed from that, you will be kicked off social media. You'll be banned from YouTube. And for things that were factually correct. Like the lab leak theory is now finally being embraced.
That's when the room temperature changed. Joe Rogan didn't frame Walz as a villain or a hero. He treated him like a human being with a long career and some very convenient summaries attached to it. And nothing makes a legacy sweat faster than being treated like it's suddenly open source. Walz's past wasn't being applauded, it was being examined. Not aggressively, just casually, like someone flipping over a product box to read the fine print. You could almost feel the moment Walz realized this conversation wasn't about praise, it was about patterns. Legacies love distance. They thrive on time, speeches, and selective memory. Rogan collapses that distance. He pulls the past into the present and asks it to explain itself without a teleprompter. At one point, the energy shifted from confidence to calculation. Tim Walz wasn't outright defending anything, he was navigating choosing words carefully, rearranging emphasis, turning firm statements into flexible explanations. The kind of verbal gymnastics you only see when someone realizes their Wikipedia summary doesn't cover the follow-up question.
Oh, you have Tim Walz is your VP? Weird. You don't think that guy's weird?
Elon's on that stage, jumping around, skipping like a dip. You know it.
He's weird in every way. Yeah. The way he walks, the way he waves his hands.
He reminds me of the clown emoji.
This has only renewed the call for Governor Tim Walz to resign.
He's a bizarre guy.
He's a strange dude.
He is currently running for a third term as governor, but this has really ramped up under his watch. There's all of this fraud exploding onto the national scene. I think it's 5 or 6 federal investigations that have now been announced in Minnesota.
Meanwhile, Joe Rogan stayed relaxed. And that's the part that really unsettled people. No dramatic pauses, no raised voice, just steady curiosity and a refusal to glide past uncomfortable territory, like someone lightly tapping a glass to see where it gives. Cracks don't mean collapse, they mean inspection. Walz's legacy didn't fall apart, it wobbled. And wobbling is far more interesting because wobbling invites conversation. It makes people ask why certain choices were celebrated while others were quietly filed away under context. That's when the internet leaned in. Because nothing unites people faster than watching a legacy lose its autopilot. Clips began circulating, not because Walz said something outrageous, but because he didn't. Every answer felt like it was doing 3 jobs at once, explaining the past, protecting the present, and avoiding damage to the future. Rogan kept pulling threads, not tearing fabric, just tugging enough to see what moved. Walz responded like someone realizing the exchange had shifted from ceremonial to conversational. That's when the legacy started to sound tired, not defeated, just worn, like it had been hauling the same narrative uphill for years, until someone finally asked whether the hill was ever necessary. Rogan didn't challenge intentions, he questioned outcomes. And outcomes are the one thing legacies can't argue with on emotion alone.
I'm doing something right when the Fox News crowd is all at me like crazy, like I'm loving it.
That guy was almost the vice president of the United States.
Elon Musk was crying last week. Tim is being mean to me, basically, you know, like, yeah.
I'm sure you've seen that thing where it shows Obama saying, I need a vice president that's dumber than me.
He may or may not have cognitive decline problems at his age, but at her age, she's just dumb.
Yeah, I think I was saying that I need a vice president dumber than me.
Great. Kamala Harris may be the dumbest person ever elected.
Because intentions are feelings, outcomes are receipts. Walz leaned into nuance, which is usually a safe place to land, but nuance under a microscope starts to look like fog. Joe Rogan didn't reject nuance. He asked how it translated into real-world impact. That's when explanations began to multiply. One answer led to a clarification. That led to historical context. That led to broader forces, and eventually to, well, it's complicated. And complicated is honest, but it's also contagious. Once complicated enters the conversation, certainty quietly leaves. The audience noticed. Comments filled up with versions of I didn't know that, and why is no one talking about this? Not outrage. Interest. That pause matters. It forces reflection. It forces someone like Walz to confront how much of his story is self-told versus collectively experienced. And when those two versions don't line up perfectly, things get awkward. Not scandalous, just human awkward. The kind where you realize your greatest hits album quietly left out a few tracks.
Tim Walz, if that guy got into power.
And for one thing, don't ever shy away from our progressive values. One person's socialism is another person's neighborliness.
Like if Kamala died and Tim Walz, Tampon Tim, was our president.
I used to think the Democrats were crazy for saying that men have periods, but then I met Tim Walz.
You know how crazy this country would be?
These guys come up with the weirdest damn ideas that you will ever imagine. You know it's true.
That weirdo who puts tampons in the boys' room. What about our...
Meanwhile, Joe Rogan never positioned himself as the authority, and that's the trick. He stayed in the role of the curious listener, which quietly forced Walz into the role of the explainer. And explaining your own legacy in real time is like narrating a movie while it's still playing. You never quite know which scene people are watching. As the conversation moved on, Tim Walz's tone shifted from declarative to reflective. Less, this is what happened, more, this is how it looked at the time. That's fair, but fairness doesn't erase questions. It creates more of them. Rogan didn't pile on. He let silence do the work, and silence gets loud when expectations are high. By the end, nothing was resolved. No winner, no viral knockout. Just a legacy rotated slightly, exposing angles people hadn't really looked at before. Walz wasn't exposed, he was contextualized. And context is dangerous, because it strips away simplicity. Somewhere out there, another microphone is warming up. And that's the quiet power of what Rogan did to Walz's legacy. He didn't kick the door down, he opened a window.
The other thing was when they decided that J.D. Vance was weird. Yeah. Remember that one?
He calls me weird, but then he lies about how his kids were conceived. Who does that? That's just the weirdest thing I've ever seen.
And then they just weirds everywhere.
Weird. Oh, you don't want a weird guy. Meanwhile, you have fucking Tim Walz. Is your VP? You don't think that guy's weird?
Super weird.
Because Minnesota, I mean, they picked this guy. He is weird. Right? I'm not weird. He's weird.
He's weird in every way. The way he walks.
And once fresh air gets in, people start noticing how stuffy the room really was. Because legacies are climate-controlled spaces, curated, carefully maintained, dusted by staffers and supporters who know exactly which angles photograph best. Joe Rogan doesn't care about the lighting. He turns the lights on and lets the shadows sort themselves out. Walz suddenly found himself in that uncomfortable zone where past decisions stop being bullet points and start becoming conversations, not debates. Conversations. The kind that don't end when the clock runs out or the applause cue hits. The kind that linger. Rogan didn't ask Walz to defend every choice. He asked him to sit with them, and once that mismatch becomes visible, it's impossible to unsee. Walz wasn't flustered in any dramatic way. No meltdown, no visible panic. It was subtler than that. The calm that comes from realizing you're no longer steering the narrative alone. You're sharing the wheel, and Joe Rogan is famously allergic to backseat driving.
Walz said that the First Amendment doesn't apply to misinformation or hate speech. Okay, well, it certainly does.
I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
Sometimes people say things wrong, and the goal of the First Amendment is you say something wrong, and then this guy who's an expert says the right thing.
I've stopped all government censorship and brought back free speech in America. It's back.
Well, so much of it turns out to be true. How about masks don't work? You would get screamed at for masks.
Every time Walz tried to reframe his legacy in broader terms, Joe Rogan gently pulled it back to specifics, not accusations, anchors, the kind that stop stories from floating too far above reality. That's when the audience really locked in, because people are exhausted by floating narratives. They want gravity, they want weight, they want to see how decisions ripple outward, not upward. Rogan understands that instinctively. Walz understands it academically, and those are two very different forms of understanding. As the discussion unfolded, Walz's legacy began to sound less like a finished chapter and more like an ongoing footnote, not rewritten, just re-examined. And re-examination feels personal even when it isn't. Rogan never framed Walz as uniquely flawed, but Walz still found himself explaining not just what he did, but why people might see it differently now. That's a dangerous position for any legacy, because time is undefeated. What once sounded decisive can start sounding evasive years later.
Walz tried to claim that his wife got pregnant through in vitro fertilization, and she said that's not true. So he lied about that.
Some of you might have heard this. This is very personal for my wife and I. When Gwen and I decided to have children, we went through years of fertility treatments. And I remember each night praying that the call was going to come and it was going to be good news. The phone would ring, tenseness in my stomach, and then the agony when you heard the treatments hadn't worked.
The First Lady of Minnesota, Gwen Walz, revealed that she underwent a different fertility treatment, not IVF, called intrauterine.
What felt pragmatic back then can feel cold now. Joe Rogan let that contrast breathe. He didn't rush to judgment. He let Walz speak long enough for the tension to form on its own, and that tension didn't come from hostility. It came from honesty colliding with expectation. At a certain point, the legacy stopped being about Walz alone and started pointing toward the system that rewards simplicity and punishes reflection. Rogan never said that outright. He didn't have to. The implication sat there, heavy and unmistakable. To his credit, Walz didn't retreat into slogans. He leaned into explanation, but explanation has limits, especially when people are already questioning the framing. That's when the conversation subtly shifted again, from what Walz intended to how Rogan's audience received it. Even when things look quiet on the surface, Rogan thrives in that quiet. He doesn't fill it with conclusions, he fills it with space. And space is where people decide for themselves. That's the real threat to any legacy. Not criticism, but autonomy.
A complete pathological liar.
Let's be honest, there are outsiders coming into communities, stealing and moving jobs away, and making life harder for people living there. And they have names, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance.
Complete liar. Lied about being in Tiananmen Square, lied about being a head coach of a football team.
Because this started, and I love this story, as a young prosecutor. Kamala Harris talked about going in that courtroom for the first time.
Pathological liars, people that are habitual liars, they just lie all the time about everything. Oh, you didn't deploy for war. You didn't. Why?
By this point, Walz's legacy wasn't being judged. It was being handled, passed from listener to listener, with each person adding their own interpretation. Joe Rogan acted less like an interrogator and more like a courier, delivering questions and letting the recipients decide what to do with them. And the internet did what it always does when ambiguity shows up. It overanalyzed everything. Short clips turned into long threads. Long threads turned into amateur think pieces. Tim Walz's name started appearing next to phrases like reevaluation and reconsideration, not condemnation. Reconsideration, the most irritating word in politics because it doesn't let you settle. It keeps you thinking. Rogan never crowned himself the judge of Walz's legacy. He positioned himself as a mirror, and mirrors don't attack. They reflect, sometimes at unflattering angles. Rogan didn't rescue Walz from that awkwardness. He let it sit, which gave the moment credibility. There's a strange honesty that surfaces when someone realizes they're being listened to, not judged. Walz seemed to reach that realization mid-conversation. The defensiveness eased. The language slowed. The legacy stopped performing and started reflecting. That reflection didn't deliver neat conclusions. It delivered complexity. And complexity is kryptonite for viral narratives, which made the entire moment even more compelling, because instead of a clean takeaway, people were left with a question mark.